I'm Colin Bennett. I'm a Professor of Political Science at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Currently a visiting professor at the Centre for Cyberspace Law and Policy at the University of New South Wales. And been researching and writing about privacy issues for 20 years. Written a number of books on that subject. And I'm interested in the way that different societies frame the problem and attitudes towards citizens to this issue, and the way that what policies work and what policies don't work in privacy.
Okay. How do you think general people feel towards privacy, especially in this modern age?
It's variable. It changes by context, it changes by time, it changes by generation, it changes by gender. Everybody draws a line somewhere about what information they share with others about their personal behavior, but that line is very different depending on the organizations that's collecting the data, whether people trust those organizations. But you know, although those are really interesting questions, my point is that a set of laws have been put in place based on a common understanding about what responsible organizations ought to do with your personal data, and those obligations tend to be quite consistent and common across countries, and that has developed over the last 30-40 years, so that there's now a pretty common understanding about, you know, what a responsible organization needs to do if it's going to claim that it's protecting your privacy.
Would you like to comment on Google? Or do you think they are a responsible organisation?
Yes and no. They have been involved in some pretty serious battles with privacy advocates and privacy regulators. It's difficult to determine whether the kind of publicity that's been attending Google over the last year or so is as a result of their mistakes, their faults, their incompetencies, their inability to manage the issue, or whether there's some more general and less benevolent motivation behind Google to capture as much personal information as possible and see whether they get away with it. I don't have a view on that. I don't know as much as other people about the internal dynamics of that company, but I am concerned that they're not learning lessons about how best to manage the issue within their company. They tend to let the engineers loose and deal with the privacy problems later rather than at the beginning.
How do you think those, say Street View for example, or other social networking services, etc., 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 how do you think those technologies or services or products are affecting human relationships or society in general?
That's a massive question.
Yeah.
Because you first of all got to determine what you mean by society. Yeah. And it's likely that the impact in Australia is going to be very different from the impact in Canada or the United States.
Okay, well, maybe take Australia for example.
Well, okay. You know, in your typical advanced industrial country, more and more information is being collected about more and more people. That information is shared with more and more organizations. It's becoming increasingly refined, and that is the basic problem that tends to get framed in terms of surveillance. It gets collected in more and more different contexts by more and more sophisticated technologies, and without people's knowledge and consent. So how is it impacting people? How is it impacting society? One of the worries is that it reduces trust in organizations, trust in government. Yeah. Okay, and so you know, and that trust is a basis of our democracy. So privacy is very much, and conversely, surveillance is very much related to the health of democratic institutions. And so having strong privacy laws in place and having those laws enforced is not just about privacy, it's about democracy, and it's about rights, and it's about legitimacy, and it's putting limitations on what powerful organizations can do with your personal information. So it's very much a political issue. if you have strong privacy laws in place, then you can control the powerful. And the problem at the moment is that our laws tend to be quite weak. Our regulators are strapped for resources, and at the same time, the issue is being challenged by a range of institutions and technologies unprecedented in human history.
So how does globalization come into the mix? I mean, you mentioned laws. I mean, some of the, like Google is based in America, obviously, it's an American corporation, but it has profound impacts in other countries and, all around the world. So how does globalization come into the mix?
Well, globalization is one of the trends over the last 30 years, and it's affected the processing of personal data internationally, as it has affected all kinds of other public policies, and slowly there's been attempts to develop agreements about to respect data when it flows offshore, when it's exported to other countries. Largely, those agreements have not worked, and there's continuing efforts to develop more global solutions to the problem, so that data collected on an Australian, if it's processed offshore, they have some guarantees that it's going to be used consistently with Australian law. It's terribly complicated, however, and my understanding is that there are some real limitations within Australian privacy law, for example, which constrain the ability of the regulators here and the Privacy Commissioner from investigating breaches that occur outside of Australia if there's not a formal company presence within Australia. And I let the lawyers argue about that one. But that is one of the huge challenges, and it relies. It's going to rely on some corporate goodwill, and it's going to rely on corporations, saying what they do openly and doing what they say. And so far, some corporations do that and many do not.
Yeah. What are your thoughts then on the surveillance society?
It's a symbol.
Yeah.
It's a piece of rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's a piece of rhetoric which has increasingly captured the attention of politicians. I was very interested in how surveillance influenced the British election.
Yeah.
It's had some traction there, and I think it's getting traction in other countries as well. It's an abstraction, and the challenge is always to relate that abstraction to the everyday experiences of ordinary people, so that they can see that that one intrusion is part of a larger pattern that needs to be debated and perhaps resisted politically. But it's there is more surveillance going on now, generally speaking, than, as I say, at any time in human history. And it has become a way that people are managed. It's become a condition of participation in our society. So the question is not whether surveillance is wrong. The question is, some surveillance is clearly necessary. The question is the conditions under which it occurs. And those conditions can only be established by law, but law supported by a supportive political culture, by activism, by groups, by self-regulation by organizations, by technology, encryption and so on. So we've written that there's a whole collection of different instruments that need to be used in order to protect privacy, and you can't simply rely on legal mechanisms these days.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I asked if you think globalization would have an impact on that.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is. Absolutely. But the problem is not just one of making sure the laws apply in different countries. It's not just a legal issue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also a technological issue, and it's also an organizational problem for companies like Google and Microsoft to put in place rules and policies that apply wherever they operate.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your thoughts.
You're welcome.
Cheers.